54 lead balls, in under 2 seconds, from one gun in the hands of one man. That was the arithmetic. 6 shells, 9 pellets in each one, fired as fast as a man could work a pump, and nothing in a trench that stood in front of it stood for long. In 1918, the soldier facing that gun carried a bolt-action rifle that fired one aimed round at a time and worked the bolt by hand between each shot. At close range, inside the width of a trench, in the 2 or 3 seconds a fight at that distance actually lasted, he was outgunned by a margin that no amount of training could close. The weapon that outgunned him was not designed for war. It was not drawn by an arms designer on the company's payroll, and it had never been built to kill a man. It was a duck gun. A sporting shotgun, sold across the counter beside fishing tackle and pocket knives, made by a company whose entire reputation rested on hunting rifles. The German government filed a formal diplomatic protest calling that shotgun a violation of the laws of war, and promised to execute any American soldier captured carrying one, while its own army fired poison gas and flame across the same strip of ground. The company that had built the gun had bought the design outright, years earlier, for a single flat fee, from a man it then drove away over a percentage. Within 13 years, that company would be bankrupt, put into the hands of a receiver, and sold at auction, brought down not by a rival gunmaker but by roller skates and kitchen knives. And the name it had failed to keep would end up owned by the corporate heirs of the very designer it had turned away. This is the story of the gun that company sold, who turned it into a weapon, and what every one of those decisions actually cost. Chapter 1. The designs they bought by the pound. In the winter of 1883, the vice president of the Winchester Repeating Arms Company boarded a train and rode most of the way across the continent to a hardware store in Ogden, Utah, because a rifle had come across his desk that his own factory could not have made. His name was Thomas Gray Bennett. He was the son-in-law of Oliver Winchester, the shirt manufacturer who had turned a failing rifle company into the most famous name in American arms, and Bennett ran the business as a serious industrial concern. The rifle that had reached him was a single-shot, dropping block design of unusual strength and simplicity, and it had been made not by a rival factory, but by a young man in a frontier gunsmith shop, working with his brothers and a set of tools, half of which he had built himself. The man's name was John Moses Browning. He was in his 20s. He had, at that point, almost no formal training, no capital of any consequence, and no way to manufacture his own designs at scale. Bennett went to Ogden to buy the rifle, and he bought it the way Winchester would buy from Browning for the next 2 decades. He paid a flat fee. The figure that comes down through the accounts is $8,000, paid once, for the rights to the design, with no continuing royalty and no share of what the gun would earn. It became the Winchester, model 1885, and it was the first of a long line. Set that number against what the relationship would eventually be worth to Winchester, and it is one of the great bargains in the history of American manufacturing. $8,000, paid once, for the entrance to the most productive design partnership the firearms industry had yet seen. Understand the structure of that deal, because the structure is the whole story of what Winchester was and what it would remain. Winchester did not employ Browning. It did not fund his workshop, share his risk, or put him on a payroll. It bought finished designs from him, outright, one at a time, at a price Browning named and Winchester accepted, and then it owned them completely. The genius was external, contracted, and paid off in a lump. Whatever those designs went on to earn over the years and decades that followed belonged entirely to Winchester, and Browning, having sold, had no further claim. It was, in the language of the trade, an outright purchase of intellectual property, and for Winchester it was extraordinarily cheap. Over the 19 years that followed, that arrangement repeated itself again and again. By the count that survives, Winchester bought something on the order of 44 separate Browning patents. It is worth pausing on what that number represents. 44 designs, from one man, across less than 2 decades, purchased for flat fees and owned in full. The lever-action rifles that defined Winchester for a generation, the models of 1886, 1892, 1894, and 1895, the guns that carried the Winchester name into the American imagination and onto the shelves of every hardware store in the country, were Browning designs, bought this way. The model 1894 alone, chambered soon after for a new smokeless cartridge called the 3030, would become one of the best-selling sporting rifles ever made. Browning drew it. Winchester owned it. There is a second, colder feature of the arrangement that reveals exactly how Winchester thought about what it was buying. It did not intend to manufacture most of what it purchased. Of the roughly 44 designs it acquired from Browning, only a fraction ever reached production. The rest were bought and shelved, acquired not to be made but to be kept out of the hands of competitors. This was a deliberate strategy, and a shrewd one. A design bought and buried cannot be sold to a rival. For a flat fee, Winchester was not only acquiring the guns it wanted to build, it was denying every one of the guns it did not build to Marlin, to Remington, to anyone else who might have paid Browning to draw for them instead. The purchases were a moat as much as a product line. Winchester was buying Browning's output wholesale, keeping the useful part and warehousing the rest so that no one else could have it. State plainly what that made Browning in the business relationship, because the plainness is the point. He was a supplier. The most gifted firearms designer of his age, a man whose work would eventually arm the militaries of the world for the better part of a century, was, to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, a vendor from whom it purchased raw designs at a good price. He was valued, and he was paid. And he was paid well by the standards of a frontier gunsmith. But he was an input. And an input, once bought, has been bought. Its bargaining power does not renew. Every design Browning sold to Winchester was a transaction closed, a fee collected, a future signed away, and for 19 years neither side had any obvious reason to change the terms, because for 19 years the terms worked for both of them. They worked especially well when the design in question was a shotgun. Winchester had built its name and its business on the lever-action repeating rifle, and its president regarded that as the company's identity in a way that went beyond commerce into something like doctrine. When Browning first brought the company a repeating shotgun in the middle of the 1880s, he recommended, on engineering grounds, that it be built as a pump, a slide action, worked back and forth by the shooter's forward hand, because a pump was sturdier and more reliable for the pressures a shotgun generated. Bennett overruled him. Winchester, Bennett insisted, was a lever-action company, and its shotgun would be a lever-action too. The result was the Winchester Model 1887, a lever-action shotgun built the way the company's identity demanded rather than the way its designer advised. It sold. Nearly 65,000 were made before it was superseded, but it was the wrong mechanism for the job. And everyone involved, Browning first among them, knew it. That disagreement over the shotgun, small and technical as it looked at the time, was the first faint crack in a partnership that would eventually break. Browning knew what the right design was. Winchester overrode him in favor of what the company already was. For the moment, it did not matter. The guns sold, the fees were paid, and the arrangement rolled on. But the pump shotgun Browning had wanted to build did not go away. He would come back to it. And when he did, Winchester would buy it, and it would become one of the most consequential products the company ever sold. A gun that would go to war, provoke an international incident, and outlive by decades the company that made it. None of them could have known that the sporting gun taking shape in Browning's mind would one day be the subject of a formal protest from a foreign government. But the arrangement that would sell it, and the arrangement that would eventually lose the man who drew it, were both already in place, written into a handshake in a Utah hardware store and a flat fee of $8,000. Chapter 2. A Gun for Ducks. In November of 1897, the Winchester catalog listed a new pump-action shotgun, and there was nothing in the listing to suggest that anyone would ever point it at a human being. It was the Model 1897, and it was the gun Browning had wanted to build all along. He had first given Winchester a slide-action shotgun in 1893, an earlier pump that had gone into the catalog that June and sold something over 34,000 units in 4 years. But the Model 1893 had been designed in the age of black powder, and the arrival of smokeless powder, which burned hotter and generated higher pressures, exposed its limits. A gun built for the gentler pressures of black powder risked fatigue and failure when fed the new ammunition. So Winchester had Browning's design reworked and strengthened into a gun that could handle smokeless loads. And that gun, introduced in the closing weeks of 1897, was the Model 1897. It was, by every measure of its design and its marketing, a civilian object. It was a hunting and sporting gun, built to be sold to farmers, to bird hunters, to men shooting clay targets at the trap range, to anyone who needed to put a pattern of shot into the air. It was chambered in 12-gauge and, later, 16-gauge, the standard bores of the sporting world. Its barrels ran from 20 inches up to 30, with special orders longer still, the range a hunter would choose from depending on whether he wanted a tight, long-range pattern for waterfowl or a shorter, quicker gun for birds flushed close. It had an exposed hammer, a design already becoming old-fashioned, that a shooter cocked with his thumb, a feature that gave the gun a distinctly 19th-century look it would keep for its entire life. It was, in short, a well-made, conventional, thoroughly commercial shotgun, and it sold the way a good commercial product sells, steadily, for a very long time, in enormous numbers. The numbers are the first thing that matters about the Model 1897, because they establish what it actually was before the war got hold of it. Winchester made the gun for 60 years, from 1897 until 1957. Over that span, it produced more than 1 million of them. That is not the profile of a weapon. It is the profile of a staple, a product so well suited to its ordinary civilian purpose that it stayed in the catalog through 2 world wars and into the atomic age, bought by hunters and farmers and sportsmen a million times over. For most of the people who ever owned a Model 1897, it was a tool for shooting birds and clay pigeons, and it never fired at anything else. Look at where it sat in the company's business. Because that placement is the reframe this whole story turns on. The Model 1897 was a sporting good. In the Winchester catalog, it lived among the hunting rifles, the .22s, the ammunition, and eventually, as the company diversified, among the fishing tackle and the pocket knives and the household hardware. It was sold through the same sporting goods counters, to the same customers, for the same recreational purposes as any other item on those pages. The gun that a foreign government would one day denounce as an instrument of unnecessary suffering, the gun whose possession would be declared a capital offense by a European power, began and remained, in the mind of the company that made it, a piece of recreational equipment. That gap, between what the gun was to its maker and what it became on a battlefield, is the space the entire story lives in. There was one feature of the Model 1897, buried in its mechanism, that meant nothing to a bird hunter and would mean a great deal in a trench. The gun had no trigger disconnector. On a modern shotgun, the trigger must be released and pulled again for each shot. The disconnector is the part that enforces that requires a separate, deliberate pull every time. The Model 1897 had no such part. A shooter could hold the trigger down and simply work the pump, and the gun would fire every time the action closed, once per stroke of the slide, as fast as the shooter could pump it. This was called slam fire, and to a man shooting clay targets it was, at most, a curiosity, a quirk of an older design. To a man clearing a trench, it would be something else entirely. But in 1897, and for the 20 years that followed, it was simply how the gun worked, an incidental property of a sporting arm that no one had any reason to think of as a military feature. Consider the price of the thing, because the price tells the truth about its status. This was a gun that sold, across the counter, for a sum in the low tens of dollars. It was affordable, ordinary, unremarkable in cost, the kind of purchase a working man made for the hunting season. There was nothing about its price, its marketing, its chambering, or its intended market that placed it in the category of a weapon of war. War guns were rifles and machine guns, bought by governments in the language of contracts and ordnance boards. The Model 1897 was bought by individuals, in ones and twos, for recreation. It was, in the most literal commercial sense, a consumer product. And yet the seed of everything that followed was already present, in the mechanism and in the ammunition it was built to fire. A 12-gauge shotgun firing a load of buckshot throws, not one projectile but many, a spreading pattern of heavy lead balls. And at close range, that pattern is one of the most destructive things a single man can carry. The gun did not need to be redesigned to become terrible. It needed only to be handed to a soldier, loaded with buckshot instead of birdshot, and pointed down the length of a trench. The company had built a sporting gun. The war would supply the rest. Before the war could do that, though, the company would make a decision that had nothing to do with the shotgun and everything to do with the man who had designed it. A decision that would cost Winchester the single most valuable relationship it had, and would plant, in the year 1902, an irony that took nearly a century to come due. Chapter 3. The Man They Let Walk. The break came over a percentage, and it came because, for the first time in 19 years, John Browning asked to be paid the way an owner is paid rather than the way a supplier is paid. By the closing years of the century, Browning had designed something genuinely new, a shotgun that loaded itself. Every repeating shotgun before it, including his own pump guns, required the shooter to work the action by hand between shots. Browning's new design used the energy of the fired shell, the recoil driving the barrel and breech backward, to eject the spent shell, cock the mechanism, and load a fresh round from the magazine so that the gun fired once for every pull of the trigger, with no pumping at all. It was the first successful auto-loading shotgun in the world, and Browning knew exactly how good it was. He had been working toward it since the late 1890s, and his first patent covering the recoil-operated mechanism was filed in the spring of 1899. When he brought it to Winchester, he brought with it a new demand. For every gun before this, across 19 years and some 44 patents, Browning had sold Winchester his designs outright for a flat fee and walked away. This time, he did not want a flat fee. He wanted a royalty, a payment on every single gun the design sold, for as long as it sold. He wanted, in other words, to stop being a supplier and start being a stakeholder, to hold a continuing claim on the value his design created rather than surrendering all of it for one lump sum. It was, by any reasonable measure, a request to be compensated in proportion to what he was actually worth. Thomas Bennett refused. The negotiation did not collapse in a single meeting. By the accounts, it dragged on for the better part of 2 years, from roughly 1899 into the early days of 1902, two men circling the same disagreement. Bennett had built a business, and a very profitable one, on the principle that Browning's designs were bought and owned, and the royalty proposal overturned that principle at its foundation. To grant Browning a royalty was to concede that the designer, not the company, was the ongoing source of the value, and to hand him a permanent seat at the table of a business Bennett controlled. Winchester had spent 19 years acquiring Browning's genius as a fixed asset, paid for and owned. It was not willing to start renting it. There is an account, from Browning himself, of the price he named, and it suggests he may have understood how the meeting would end before it began. He is said to have set a figure so high for the outright purchase that there was little real chance Winchester would accept it, as though he had already decided the flat fee era was over and was giving the old arrangement one last, deliberately impossible test. Whether or not that reading is exactly right, the outcome is not in dispute. In January of 1902, the deal died. Browning walked out of the Winchester relationship, and he never did business with the company again. 19 years, 44 patents, the entire design foundation of the most famous name in American arms, ended in a disagreement over whether the man who drew the guns would share in what they earned. What Browning did next is the part that would take a century to finish paying off. He took the auto-loading shotgun to Remington, the other great American arms maker, and there the story turned strange and grim. Browning arrived at the Remington factory to make his case, and while he sat waiting to be seen, the president of Remington, Marcellus Hartley, died of a heart attack in the building. The date was the 8th of January, 1902. The man Browning had come to sell to was gone in an afternoon, and the meeting that might have kept the design in American hands never happened. So Browning went abroad. On the 24th of March, 1902, he signed a contract with Fabrique Nationale, the great Belgian arms manufacturer at Herstal, granting it the rights to make and sell the auto-loading shotgun. And this time, he got what Winchester had refused him. He got his royalty. The gun went into production in Belgium as the Browning Automatic 5, the Auto 5, and it became one of the most successful shotguns ever made, produced for very nearly a century. Browning took a personal order of 10,000 of them to sell in the United States, and all 10,000 sold inside a year. The design Winchester had let walk out the door over a percentage went on to earn its designer a fortune in Belgium under terms Winchester had said no to. Weigh the two decisions Winchester made in this chapter against each other, because together they define the company's deepest and most expensive habit. Winchester was superb at acquiring genius cheaply and catastrophic at keeping it. For 19 years, it had bought Browning's work at bargain prices and owned the results outright, and that had made it rich. But the same instinct that made the bargains, the refusal to let the designer share in the ongoing value, was the instinct that lost him entirely the moment he asked for a fairer deal. The company would rather lose the man than change the terms. It valued control over the relationship more than it valued the relationship itself, and in January of 1902, it got exactly what it preferred: full ownership of 44 old designs, and no claim whatsoever on anything Browning would ever draw again. The cost of that preference would not be visible for a very long time. In 1902, it looked like a hard-nosed negotiation that had simply broken down, the kind of thing that happens in business. Winchester still had its lever rifles, its pump shotguns, its factory, and its name. It had the model, 1897, Browning's design, bought and owned and selling by the tens of thousands. Losing the autoloader stung, but the company was vast, and the loss was one gun. What Winchester could not see, standing in the early days of 1902, was that it had just handed the future to a company across the Atlantic, and that the corporate family Browning was walking toward in Belgium would, in the fullness of time, and after Winchester itself had died and been resurrected and died again, come to own the very name over the door. The man Winchester let walk in 1902 was building, in Belgium, the company that would one day own Winchester. But that reckoning was 90 years away. Between it and this moment stood a world war, and a sporting gun that was about to be handed a rifle's job. Chapter 4. Buckshot in the Jungle. The first time the United States Army carried a Winchester pump shotgun into a war, it did so on the far side of the Pacific, in a jungle campaign that would teach one young officer a lesson he would still be acting on 18 years later. The setting was the Philippines, at the turn of the century, during the long and brutal war that followed the American annexation of the islands. Around the year 1900, the Army acquired a quantity of Model 1897 shotguns, a modest number, something on the order of 200, and sent them to the Philippines for use in the close, confused fighting that the terrain and the enemy imposed. This was not trench warfare. It was jungle and village fighting, at short range, against an opponent who often closed the distance fast, and in that environment, a rifle firing one carefully aimed round at a time was not always the right tool. A shotgun firing a spreading load of buckshot, throwing 9 or more heavy pellets with each shell, put far more into the air at close range, and did not require the precise aim that a moving, charging target denied. The Army had reached, for the first time, for the sporting gun as a close-quarters answer, and it had worked. The number 200 is worth holding on to because it establishes the scale of the thing at this stage. This was not a mass adoption. It was a small, practical procurement for a specific tactical problem in a specific theater, a few hundred civilian-pattern shotguns bought and shipped because the men on the ground found them useful in the kind of fighting they were doing. The Model 1897 had, in a quiet way, passed its first military audition, not as a designed weapon of war, but as a sporting gun that happened to solve a battlefield problem better than the issue rifle did. Nobody wrote a doctrine around it. Nobody in Germany, or anywhere else, took the slightest diplomatic notice. It was 200 shotguns in a colonial war, and it made no headlines. But one of the officers who served in that war, and who absorbed its lessons about close-quarters firepower, was a man named John Joseph Pershing. Pershing's career in the Philippines was formative. He made his early reputation there, fighting exactly the kind of close, irregular campaign in which the shotgun had proven itself. Whether or not he personally handled the guns in every engagement, he came out of that period as an officer who understood, from direct experience, what massed close-range firepower did in a fight where the enemy got close. That understanding would sit in his mind for the better part of 2 decades. And when he found himself commanding not a few hundred men in a jungle, but an army of millions in the trenches of France, he would remember it. This is how a small proof scales, and it is worth naming the mechanism, because it recurs throughout business as well as war. A product finds its first success in a narrow, almost overlooked application. A few hundred units, one obscure theater, one specific problem solved. And in the process, it wins over not a market, but a person, an individual with direct experience of what the thing can do, who is then carried by his own career into a position where he can order it by the tens of thousands. The Model 1897's path from a sporting good to a weapon of the Western Front did not run through an ordnance board's abstract evaluation. It ran through the memory of one officer who had seen buckshot work in the Philippines and who rose, over 18 years, to a command from which he could act on that memory. The gun itself, in those Philippine years, was entirely unmodified from its civilian form. It was the standard Model 1897, the same gun sold to duck hunters, carrying its ordinary barrel, without the heat shield, the bayonet, or the other military fittings that would later define the trench gun. The Army had simply taken a sporting shotgun off the commercial shelf and issued it, loaded with buckshot, to soldiers. That fact matters, because it establishes the pattern that would hold all the way through. The military did not commission Winchester to design a weapon. It reached into the civilian catalog, took a product built for birds, and put it to work on men. The weaponization of the Model 1897 was always an act performed by the buyer, not the maker. Winchester built a sporting gun. The Army decided what it was for. For a decade and a half after the Philippines, the matter rested. The Model 1897 went on selling to hunters by the tens of thousands a year, the ordinary commercial success it had always been. The Army kept some shotguns in inventory, useful for guarding prisoners and for the occasional close-quarters need, but there was no war that demanded them in quantity, and no reason to think there would be. The gun's military career looked like a closed footnote, 200 units in a colonial campaign, a curiosity of ordnance history. Then, in the summer of 1914, the powers of Europe went to war, and within months the war congealed into a form that no one had planned for and that the shotgun, of all the weapons in the world, was strangely suited to. The lines of trenches ran from the sea to the mountains. Between them lay ground swept by machine guns and artillery, impossible to cross in the open. And the fighting that actually decided the possession of those trenches was, at its most intimate, a matter of small groups of men moving through narrow ditches at a range of a few feet, in a space where a long rifle was an awkward, slow, unwieldy thing, and where the ability to put a wall of shot into a confined space at arm's length was worth more than marksmanship at 400 yards. The war had, without intending to, created the perfect conditions for the sporting gun. And when the United States finally entered that war, in the spring of 1917, the officer commanding its armies in France was the same man who had watched buckshot work in the Philippines 17 years before. The 200 shotguns of 1900 were about to become tens of thousands. The Model 1897 was about to be handed a job no one had designed it for, and it was about to do that job so well that a foreign government would try to have it outlawed. Chapter 5. Off the Shelf, Into the Trench. The United States entered the war in April of 1917, and its army arrived in France to find a problem that its standard weapons did not solve. The problem was the trench itself, and the peculiar, terrible kind of fighting that taking one required. The Western Front by 1917 was a system of deadlock. Two lines of entrenchments faced each other across a strip of churned ground, and the great weapons of the war, the machine guns and the massed artillery, made crossing that ground in the open a form of suicide. But the trenches were still taken, and retaken, in raids and assaults, and the moment a body of attacking infantry actually reached the enemy line, the character of the fight changed completely. It stopped being a matter of long-range fire and became a close, savage struggle inside the trench, in a zigzagging ditch a few feet wide, at ranges measured in feet rather than yards, in the dark, around blind corners, in dugouts and traverses. It was the most intimate fighting of the war, and it was fought hand to hand, with pistols, knives, clubs, sharpened spades, and grenades. In that environment, the weapon the American soldier carried was a liability. The standard infantry rifle of the war, whatever the nation, was a bolt-action weapon, something over 4 feet long, designed to fire an aimed round across hundreds of yards of open ground. Inside a trench, it was a poor tool. It was too long to swing around a corner, too slow to fire more than one shot before an enemy at close range was upon the man who carried it, and it required a deliberate, hand-worked bolt stroke between each round. A man who missed his first shot in a trench fight rarely got a well-aimed second. What was needed was a weapon that could put a large, spreading, immediately lethal charge into a confined space at close range, fast, without precise aim, and could do it again and again in the space of a few seconds. The American Army knew exactly what such a weapon looked like, because one of its own officers had watched it work in the Philippines. The answer was the shotgun, loaded with buckshot, and the American command reached for it deliberately. General Pershing's headquarters supported the adoption of the shotgun as a trench-fighting weapon, and the Army went shopping not among the great arsenals of military ordnance, but in the civilian catalogs of the American sporting goods industry. It found the model 1897. State plainly what the Army did, because it is the exact mechanism at the heart of this entire story. It did not commission the design of a trench weapon. It did not go to Winchester and ask for a purpose-built military arm. It took a sporting shotgun, a hunting gun that had been in the civilian catalog for 20 years and sold by the million, and it adapted that gun, with a handful of modifications, into a weapon of war. The trench gun was not invented, it was converted. A consumer product was pulled off the shelf and militarized, and the militarization amounted to a short list of changes to a design that was, at its core, unaltered. The changes were practical and few. The barrel was cut down to 20 inches, a cylinder bore, shorter than any sporting barrel, to make the gun quick and handy in the cramped space of a trench. Over that barrel went a ventilated steel handguard, a perforated metal sleeve, so that a soldier could grip the gun and even hold it by the barrel area without burning his hand when the metal grew hot from firing, the perforations letting the heat escape. To the muzzle end was fitted an adapter that allowed the gun to mount a bayonet, the same long meters 1917 blade the Army's rifles used, so that when the shells ran out, the shotgun became a spear like every other infantry weapon. And that was, in essence, the whole conversion. A shorter barrel, a heat shield, and a bayonet lug, bolted onto a sporting gun that was otherwise the model 1897 a hunter could buy at any hardware counter. The military designation given to the gun reflected exactly what it was, a trench gun built on a commercial pattern, and it went to war in 12 gauge, the ordinary sporting bore. There was one more change, and it came from the mud. The commercial ammunition the gun was designed to fire used paper shells, the standard shotgun cartridge of the civilian world, a cardboard tube crimped over the shot. Paper shells were fine in a duck blind and a disaster in a trench. In the perpetual wet of the Western Front, the paper swelled, softened, and deteriorated, and a swollen shell would not chamber or would jam the gun. The answer was to make the shells out of brass, solid metal cases that shrugged off the damp, and the buckshot loads issued for the trench guns were accordingly produced in brass. It was a small change, and it points at a large truth. Turning a sporting gun into a weapon of war was not only a matter of the gun, but of the entire system of ammunition, supply, and durability that a battlefield demands and a hunting trip does not. The gun that resulted was, on paper, a modest thing. It held 6 rounds, 5 in the tubular magazine under the barrel and 1 in the chamber. It fired a load of buckshot, the standard combat load being double-aught buck, 9 pellets of roughly 1/3 of an inch in diameter in each shell. It weighed what a shotgun weighs. It had the exposed hammer and the old-fashioned lines of an 1897 design, and it was, mechanically, exactly the sporting gun it had always been. There was nothing exotic about it, no new engineering, no ordnance board innovation. It was a duck gun with a shortened barrel, a heat shield, a bayonet, and brass shells. The Army began getting them to France in the last year of the war. By the 8th of June, 1918, roughly 1,000 shotguns were reported available in the French depots, and testing and issue were authorized for the American divisions arriving to fight. Over the months that followed, the trench guns went out to the fighting divisions of the American Expeditionary Force, the 5th, the 26th, the 32nd, the 35th, the 42nd, the 77th, the 82nd, the units that would do the hard fighting of the war's final campaigns. A sporting gun, converted, was being handed to soldiers and sent into the worst fighting on earth. What the gun did when it got there was so far beyond what its modest specifications suggested that it changed how the enemy thought about the war and prompted, within weeks, the most extraordinary reaction any American weapon of the war would provoke. Chapter 6. The Trench Broom. The soldiers who carried it into the trenches gave it a name that told the truth about what it did. They called it the trench broom because it swept a trench clear of men. Understand first the specific, mechanical reason a 12-gauge shotgun was so devastating in a trench. Because the horror of it was a matter of simple arithmetic. Each shell the gun fired contained not one projectile but 9, a load of double-aught buckshot, 9 lead balls, each about 1/3 of an inch across, each one comparable in size and lethality to a pistol bullet. A single pull, and 9 heavy pellets flew down the trench in a spreading pattern. At the ranges, a trench fight was actually fought. A few feet to a few yards, that pattern had barely begun to spread, so that all 9 pellets struck in a tight, murderous cluster. One shell was, in effect, 9 bullets fired at once. And the gun held 6 shells. Now add the mechanism that the sporting design had carried, unremarked, for 20 years. The Model 1897 had no trigger disconnector, which meant it could slam fire. A soldier did not have to release and pull the trigger for each shot. He could hold the trigger down and simply work the pump back and forth, and the gun fired every time the action closed, once for every stroke of his hand, as fast as he could pump. 6 shells, 9 pellets each, fired as fast as a man could work a slide, which was very fast indeed. By some accounts, a trench gun in the hands of a determined soldier could empty all 6 rounds in under 2 seconds. Do that arithmetic to its end. 6 shells, 9 pellets in each, is 54 heavy lead balls, delivered in the time it takes to say the number, into the confined space of a trench where the enemy had nowhere to go. That was the trench broom. That was what it swept. Set that output against the weapon on the other side of the fight, because the comparison is the entire value of the thing. A German soldier in the same trench carried a bolt-action rifle. He fired 1 round, worked the bolt by hand, fired again. In a fight at arm's length, in the 2 or 3 seconds before the matter was decided, he might get off 1 shot, possibly 2. The American beside him, with the shotgun, could put 54 pellets into that same space in the same 2 seconds. It was not a contest of marksmanship. It was a contest of how much lethal metal a single man could put into a small space in a very short time. And by that measure, the converted duck gun was not merely better than the rifle. It was in a different category altogether. In the specific, narrow, terrible circumstances of trench clearing, 1 man with a trench broom was worth a squad with rifles. That is the reframe that matters, and it is a business reframe as much as a military one. The product Winchester had built was a sporting shotgun, and its value in that market was ordinary. It patterned well, it was reliable, it was reasonably priced, but dropped into an environment its makers never imagined. Loaded with buckshot instead of birdshot, the same unaltered mechanism delivered a competitive advantage so lopsided that no adjustment on the other side could close it. The gun had not been improved. Its context had changed, and in the new context, a feature that had been a curiosity, the slam fire, and a capability that had been for birds, the buckshot pattern, combined into something an enemy soldier experienced as a wall of death coming down a ditch at him. The same object, moved from the duck marsh to the trench, went from a good sporting gun to one of the most feared close-quarters weapons of the war. The reputation spread fast, and it spread in the currency of stories. Some of those stories are documented, and some are legend, and honesty about the record requires sorting them. It was widely told that American soldiers used the trench guns to shoot enemy hand grenades out of the air as they were thrown, knocking the grenades down with a pattern of shot before they could land. It is a vivid image, and it captures the terror the gun inspired. But the better supported assessment treats the grenade shooting stories as dubious, the kind of tale that grows around a fearsome weapon. What is better attested, and stranger, is that soldiers used the guns to bring down carrier pigeons, the birds the enemy used to send messages, shooting them out of the sky with the same loads meant for men. There is a famous account of a Sergeant Fred Lloyd single-handedly clearing a German-held village with a trench gun, working from position to position and routing dozens of defenders. But the sober sources flag that story too as legend rather than established fact. The truth of the trench broom did not need the legends. Its documented arithmetic, 54 pellets in 2 seconds into a confined space, was terrible enough. There is a number that puts the whole military episode in its business proportion, and it is a number about how few of these guns there actually were. The best supported figures suggest that Winchester delivered something on the order of 19,000 Model 1897 trench guns during the war, out of roughly 25,000 of the type manufactured, with some secondary accounts rounding the delivered figure upward toward the 25,000 mark. Winchester also built its newer hammerless pump, the Model 12, in a trench configuration, with a further quantity, reported at around 20,000, purchased by the Army, though that figure rests on thinner evidence and should be treated as reported rather than confirmed. Other makers contributed smaller numbers. Remington's Model 10 trench gun was delivered in the low thousands. Set the total against the more than 1 million Model 1897's Winchester made over the gun's life, and against the hundreds of thousands of rifles the company turned out for the war, and the trench guns are a rounding error. This was never, in dollar terms, a significant Winchester contract. It was a tiny sideline, a few tens of thousands of converted sporting guns, dwarfed by everything else the company was doing. And that is the paradox this story keeps returning to. The gun that made Winchester the subject of an international diplomatic incident, the product a great power would formally denounce as a war crime, was, to Winchester's accountants, almost invisible. It generated a headline out of all proportion to its revenue. The company's real war, the war that would determine whether Winchester survived the decade, was being fought not on the shotgun line but in the vast expansion of its rifle production, financed by a mountain of debt that was quietly being stacked, in these same years, on the foundations of the New Haven plant. The trench broom was sweeping trenches in France. The debt was being loaded in Connecticut. And the second of those two things would prove far more dangerous to Winchester than anything the German army ever did. Chapter 7. The Boom on Borrowed Money. While a few thousand converted shotguns were making Winchester famous in the trenches, the company was making a set of financial decisions in New Haven that would prove far more consequential than any weapon and would nearly destroy it. The war was, for Winchester, the greatest business opportunity in its history, and the company met it the way an ambitious enterprise meets a boom, by borrowing enormously to build the capacity to capture it. When the European War broke out in 1914, the belligerents needed rifles and ammunition on a scale their own industries could not supply, and they came to American manufacturers with contracts of a size the industry had never seen. Winchester, with its established plant and its reputation, was positioned to take them, and it took them aggressively. It contracted to build the pattern 1914 rifle for Britain, and delivered something on the order of 250,000 of them before the United States even entered the war. It contracted with Imperial Russia to build 300,000 of its Model 1895 lever-action rifles, chambered for the Russian cartridge, for the armies of the Tsar. When America itself entered the war in 1917, Winchester took on the manufacture of the Meters 1917 Enfield, the rifle that would arm the majority of American soldiers in France, and produced more than 545,000 of them. It built Browning automatic rifles. It ran, at full tilt, as one of the great arsenals of the Allied war effort. To do all of that, Winchester had to grow, and it grew at a pace that only borrowed money could finance. The New Haven plant swelled into a vast industrial complex of roughly 3 million square feet. The workforce, which had numbered a few thousand before the war, climbed past 17,000 men and women at its wartime peak. The government stationed its own inspectors on the factory floor to oversee the military work, a permanent presence of officers, enlisted men, and hundreds of civilian inspectors embedded in the plant. Winchester had become, in the space of a few years, an industrial giant several times its former size, and every brick of that expansion had been paid for with debt. Look closely at how that debt was structured, because the structure is where the danger lived. In 1915, to finance the first wave of expansion, Winchester borrowed a large sum, reported at over $8 million, from the house of J.P. Morgan. That was substantial, but survivable. Then, in early 1916, the company borrowed again, and this time on terms that carried a hidden blade. It took a loan reported at $16 million from the banking house of Kidder, Peabody and Company, and the terms of that loan included an option. If Winchester defaulted, Kidder Peabody would have the right to purchase a controlling interest in the company. Read that clause carefully, because it is the whole future of Winchester compressed into a single line of a loan agreement. The company had not merely borrowed money, it had put its own control on the table as collateral. It had agreed that if it could not pay, the bankers could take the company. That is the reframe of this chapter, and it is the coldest kind of business truth. Debt secured on ordinary assets is a burden. Debt secured on control is a loaded gun pointed at the founder's own head. Winchester had spent the war years building an enormous industrial machine on borrowed money, and it had accepted, as a condition of the borrowing, that the men who lent the money could seize the company if the machine ever failed to generate enough cash to service the loans. As long as the war ran and the contracts flowed, the arrangement held, because wartime revenue was more than enough to cover the payments. But wars end, and the machine Winchester had built was sized for a war. With a plant of 3 million square feet and a workforce of 17,000, all of it configured to produce military rifles by the hundreds of thousands under contracts that would vanish the moment the guns fell silent. Consider the position the company was in as the war approached its end, laid out as a simple problem in arithmetic. Winchester owned a colossal factory, built for war, carrying a mountain of debt whose repayment depended on keeping that factory busy, under loan terms that would hand the company to the bankers if it could not pay. When the war ended, the military contracts that fed the factory would end with it. and the enormous plant would fall idle, with no wartime revenue to service the debt that had built it. The company would face a choice between an idle factory and a defaulted loan, and the defaulted loan meant losing control. There was, in other words, a trap built into the very success of the war years, and the trap was set to spring the moment peace arrived. The armistice came in November of 1918, and it was, for the world, a deliverance, and for Winchester, the beginning of the crisis. The contracts stopped. The great machine, built to arm nations, had nothing to make. The debt remained, exactly as large as before, and now there was no torrent of military revenue to pay it down. Winchester was left holding an industrial plant sized for a conflict that was over, with obligations sized for the same conflict, and a controlling interest pledged to bankers who would take it if the payments stopped. The company that had armed the Allies had, in the process of arming them, mortgaged itself to the edge of its own survival. The men who would decide the company's fate were, increasingly, not the Winchester family or the old management, but the financiers whose money had built the wartime plant. In the reorganization that followed the war, in 1919, the control that had been pledged in the loan agreements began to pass. A new corporate parent was formed, and the banking interests, Kidder Peabody chief among them, gained the controlling position, while the Winchester family, the heirs of Oliver Winchester who had built the name, lost command of the company that bore it. The pattern is one this account has seen before and will see again. The people who supply the capital end up owning the enterprise, and the people whose name is over the door become, in time, employees or bystanders in their own company. The debt had done its work. Control had moved. And now the men who held that control faced the trap in its full dimensions. They had a giant factory, a giant debt, and no war. They needed, desperately, something for the plant to make. Some product that could fill 3 million square feet and generate the revenue to service $16 million in loans, now that the rifles no longer would. The answer they arrived at would prove to be one of the most instructive strategic errors in American business history, and it would begin with the entirely reasonable observation that the company had a trusted name, a huge factory, and a nation full of hardware stores. But that error, and the ruin it produced, was still a year or two away. In the autumn of 1918, in the last weeks of the fighting, Winchester's converted duck gun was doing its work in the trenches of France, and it was about to provoke, from the government on the other side of the wire, a reaction that no other American weapon of the war would draw: a formal declaration, in the language of international law, that the gun itself was a crime. Chapter 8. Forfeits his life. In the middle of September 1918, with the war less than 2 months from its end, the government of Germany did something it had done for no other weapon the Americans fielded. It filed a formal legal protest demanding that the United States stop using the shotgun, and it backed the demand with a threat to execute American soldiers. The mechanics of the protest ran through the delicate channels that enemies at war use to speak to one another. Germany and the United States had no direct diplomatic relations. They were at war. So the German protest was routed through neutral intermediaries, transmitted from Berlin through the diplomatic apparatus of neutral powers, and delivered, in Washington, by the representative of Switzerland, the neutral nation that handled such communications between the belligerents. The German note was transmitted in the middle of September, around the 15th, and it was presented to the American Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, by the Swiss Chargé d'Affaires on or about the 19th of September, 1918. The precise dating has caused some confusion in the accounts, with the 14th, 15th, and 19th all appearing in various tellings, the discrepancy arising from the difference between the day the note was sent from the German side and the day it was formally handed over in Washington. The documented delivery to Lansing is the 19th. The substance, whatever the exact date, is preserved in the records of the United States State Department, where the protest and the American reply survive as primary documents. What the note said is the heart of the matter. Germany asserted that the American shotgun, firing its load of buckshot, was a weapon forbidden by the laws of war. The specific legal ground it cited was the Hague Convention respecting the laws and customs of war on land, and in particular the article of that convention which prohibits the employment of arms, projectiles, or material calculated to cause unnecessary suffering. This was Article 23, paragraph E, of the Hague Rules, the clause that forbids weapons whose purpose or effect is to aggravate the suffering of the men they strike beyond what is militarily necessary to put them out of the fight. Germany's argument was that the shotgun, throwing 9 or more heavy pellets to tear multiple wounds in a single man, was exactly such a weapon, an instrument of unnecessary suffering, and therefore illegal. Then came the threat, and it was the threat that made the protest extraordinary rather than merely legalistic. Germany did not simply demand that the Americans stop using the shotgun. It declared what would happen to American soldiers who did not. The language preserved in the record is stark. Every prisoner found to have in his possession such guns or ammunition belonging thereto forfeits his life. Read that sentence for what it actually promised. Any American soldier captured with a shotgun, or even with the buckshot shells for one, would be put to death. Not imprisoned, not tried as an ordinary prisoner of war, executed for the crime of carrying that particular weapon. And Germany gave the United States a deadline, demanding a reply before the 1st of October, 1918. Sit with what that meant, stated as plainly as the record allows. A sovereign government, at war, had formally notified its enemy that it would execute captured soldiers, not for any act of atrocity, not for a violation of the ordinary customs of war, but for the possession of a specific commercial product. The gun in question was a sporting shotgun, a Winchester Model 1897 or its Model 12 stablemate, a hunting gun that had been sold across American counters for 2 decades. Germany was declaring that to carry that gun was a capital offense, and that any young American found holding one when he was captured would be shot for it. The most feared reaction any American weapon provoked in the entire war was provoked not by a machine gun, not by artillery, not by the great instruments of industrial killing, but by a converted duck gun. There is a business observation to be made here, and it is worth making even in the middle of so grim a scene, because it is the observation this whole account exists to make. A protest of this kind, however hostile, is a form of testimony. When a great power stops the machinery of its wartime diplomacy to file a formal legal complaint against a single enemy weapon and threatens to kill men over it, it is saying something unambiguous about that weapon. That it works, that it frightens, that it is doing enough damage to be worth the extraordinary step of trying to have it outlawed. Germany did not protest the American rifle, which was a licensed British design built in American factories. It did not protest the American artillery. It protested the shotgun. Because the shotgun, in the specific hell of trench clearing, was doing something the German soldier found unbearable, and the German command wanted it stopped. The protest was, in the coldest commercial reading, an involuntary and unimpeachable endorsement of the product's effectiveness, delivered by the one party with every reason to lie about it. The gun that drew this reaction was, remember, a rounding error in Winchester's business, a few tens of thousands of converted sporting guns against a company that had just built 1 million rifles for the war. The company's name was not on the diplomatic note. The note spoke of shotguns, not of Winchester. But the weapon at the center of the protest was overwhelmingly the Winchester pump, the Model 1897 above all, loaded with the buckshot that the army had chosen. A German legal argument, transmitted through Switzerland and laid on the desk of the American Secretary of State, was, at bottom, a demand that the United States stop using a Winchester product, on pain of executing the men who carried it. The demand now sat with Robert Lansing, and the reply he and the American government composed would do something that the German command cannot have anticipated. It would not only reject the protest, it would turn the German note into the single most damning self-indictment of the war, by pointing at the weapons the accusing government was itself using on the very same battlefield. Chapter 9. The best advertisement Germany ever bought. The American answer to the German protest was cold, brief, and devastating, and its power came from a single, unanswerable fact. The government complaining about the shotgun was the government that had brought poison gas to the battlefield. Lansing did not equivocate. The reply the United States prepared, drawing on the legal judgment of the Army's own Judge Advocate General, rejected the German claim outright and refused to withdraw the weapon. The acting Judge Advocate General examined the German argument and found it without legal merit, and the State Department's reply, composed in the last days of September 1918, stated the American position in language the record preserves. The shotgun, it said, could not be the subject of legitimate or reasonable protest, and its use would not be abandoned. The Hague provision Germany had cited, the American reply held, did not forbid a weapon of this kind. The shotgun was a lawful arm. It caused no more suffering, and no more unnecessary suffering, than the many other weapons both sides used without objection, and the attempt to single it out as illegal had no foundation in the law of war. Then the United States answered the threat with a threat of its own, and it did so in the plain language of reprisal. If Germany carried out its promise to execute American soldiers over the shotgun, the reply stated, it would be the right and the duty of the United States to make such reprisals as would best protect the American forces. The meaning was unmistakable. Execute our men for carrying shotguns, and we will retaliate in kind against yours. The United States was not going to withdraw the weapon, was not going to concede the legal point, and was not going to let the execution threat stand unanswered. It met the German note with a flat refusal and a promise of retaliation, and then it waited. But the true force of the American position was not in the legal argument or the counter-threat. It was in the situation itself, in the almost unbelievable gap between what Germany was protesting and what Germany was doing. Consider the record of the war on the German side, laid out in dates. On the 22nd of April, 1915, at Ypres, the German army had released more than 150 tons of chlorine gas across the battlefield, the first large-scale lethal poison gas attack in the history of warfare. drifting a cloud of chemical death onto the French lines and opening a new and monstrous chapter in the ways men could be killed. In February of 1915, at Malincourt, Germany had used flamethrowers against the French. In July of that year, at Hooge, it had used them against the British, spraying burning fuel across the trenches to roast men alive in their positions. These were German innovations, German weapons, introduced by the German army years before it discovered a moral objection to the American shotgun. Hold the two things side by side, because the contrast is the entire point, and it requires no editorializing to land. In September of 1918, the government that had introduced poison gas to the world, that had pioneered the military flamethrower, that had bombed cities from the air, filed a formal legal protest declaring that a shotgun caused unnecessary suffering and must be banned. The nation that had loosed chlorine at Ypres was objecting, on humanitarian grounds, to buckshot. The army that burned men alive with flame was demanding the outlawing of a duck gun. The claim of unnecessary suffering, coming from that quarter, collapsed under its own weight the moment anyone laid the German arsenal beside the American one. Whatever the legal merits of the Hague argument in the abstract, the specific government making it had forfeited any standing to make it, and the American reply had only to gesture at the gas and the flame for the protest to dissolve. The historians and legal writers who have examined the episode since have reached a consistent verdict. The shotgun protest is generally regarded as the one formal instance in the entire war in which the United States was accused of fielding an illegal or inhumane weapon under the Hague Rules, and the accusation is treated as legally unfounded. Buckshot, the serious analysis concludes, is a legitimate projectile, causing no more suffering than rifle fire, and the article Germany cited was aimed at weapons designed to aggravate wounds in specific forbidden ways, expanding bullets and the like, not at a smoothbore gun firing round lead shot. The protest, in the cool judgment of the law, was baseless. In the judgment of the battlefield, it was worse than baseless. It was hypocritical, filed by the war's foremost pioneer of chemical and incendiary killing against one of its least exotic weapons. The threat was never carried out. No American soldier is known to have been executed for carrying a shotgun. Germany, having received the American refusal and the promise of reprisal, let the matter drop, and within weeks the question was moot, because the war itself was ending. The armistice came on the 11th of November, 1918, less than 2 months after the protest was delivered, and the whole extraordinary episode, the note through Switzerland, the citation of the Hague Rules, the threat to execute prisoners, the American refusal and counterthreat, passed into history as a strange and revealing footnote to the war's final autumn. The shotgun stayed in service. The men who carried it were not shot for it. And the protest achieved nothing except to record, permanently, in the diplomatic archives of the United States, that Germany had considered the Winchester pump gun terrible enough to try to ban. Reckon the whole episode as the business event it also was, because that is this account's particular angle, and it yields something the purely military histories miss. Winchester had, without spending $1 on it, without even being named in the correspondence, received the most extraordinary product endorsement in the history of the arms trade. A rival great power had testified, in a formal legal document, that the company's converted sporting gun was so effective in combat that it ought to be illegal, and had threatened to kill men rather than face it. No advertising budget could buy that. No demonstration on a testing ground could argue it. The enemy's own diplomats had certified, in writing, that 54 pellets in 2 seconds down a trench was a thing worth going to the mat over. The gun was a sideline that had generated a legend, and the legend was stamped with the seal of the German Foreign Office. And here the deepest irony of the whole account begins to gather. Because the gun that Germany could not stop, the gun that the United States refused to withdraw, the gun that would go on serving for decades, belonged to a company that could not save itself. The trench broom would outlive the war, the protest, the men who fired it, and, in the end, the company that made it. Winchester had built a product durable enough to fight in wars its makers would not live to see. It had not built a business durable enough to survive the peace. Chapter 10. The gun that would not retire. The war that made the trench gun famous ended in 1918, and the gun did not. It went on serving, in one American conflict after another, for more than half a century, long after the trenches were filled in and the company that built it had passed through bankruptcy and into other hands. The design's durability was a matter of the same simple fitness that had made it terrible in the first place. A pump shotgun firing buckshot at close range solved a specific military problem, the problem of overwhelming an enemy at very short distance. And that problem did not go away when the Western Front did. Every war has its close quarters moments, its rooms to clear, its jungles and its trenches and its ambushes at arm's length. And in every one of them, the shotgun kept doing the one thing it did better than any rifle. So the Army kept it. The Model 1897 stayed in the inventory. Its newer sibling, the hammerless Model 12, stayed alongside it. And when the next Great War came, they went back out. The Second World War put the trench guns to work again, and in larger numbers than the First. The Pacific Theater, in particular, was made for them. The jungle fighting, the close and sudden combat of island campaigns, the need to clear bunkers and hold positions against close assault, all of it played to exactly the strengths the gun had shown in France. The Marine Corps, the Army, the Navy, and the Army Air Forces bought shotguns in quantity. The Model 12 alone was purchased in numbers reported above 80,000 for the Second World War, far more than the trench guns of the First. The gun was simplified for wartime economy, the perforated heat shield reduced from 6 rows of holes to 4 beginning in 1942. But the essential weapon was unchanged, the same pump-action buckshot gun, doing the same close work in a new set of jungles. It did not stop there. The Model 1897 remained in American service through the Korean War, and refurbished shotguns of the Second World War generation were pulled from storage and sent to Vietnam, where the close jungle fighting once again suited them. In Vietnam, the guns seeing the hardest use were the older pumps. The Winchester, Model 12, and others of its era, recycled and reissued until the supplies of the old guns were finally used up. A design that had been drawn in the 1890s for shooting birds was still going to war in the 1960s and beyond. The Model 1897 was made by Winchester until 1957, a production run of 60 years, more than 1 million guns, spanning from the frontier era to the space age. State the reframe, because it is the one this chapter exists to make, and it is a reframe about products and the companies that make them. A product that solves one job perfectly can outlive every arrangement of ownership and finance that surrounds it. The trench gun was the same object in 1918, in 1943, in 1953, and in 1968. It did not need to be reinvented, because the job it did, killing men at close range with a load of shot, did not change. The gun was a fixed, finished answer to a permanent question, and permanence of that kind is the rarest thing a manufacturer can produce. Winchester had built, almost by accident, out of a sporting gun and a war contract, a weapon so well matched to its task that it served for the better part of a century. And here is the bitter symmetry the chapter turns on. The gun was durable. The company was not. The trench gun would serve through the Second World War, Korea, and Vietnam, but the company whose name was stamped on it would not survive the 1920s intact, would pass into receivership in 1931, would be sold at auction to a firm a fraction of its size, and would spend the rest of the century being bought, licensed, and handed from owner to owner. The product outlived the producer by generations. Winchester the gun kept fighting America's wars. Winchester, the company, the enterprise that had built the plant and taken the debt and sold the guns, was already, in the years right after its greatest triumph, walking into the worst decision it would ever make. It had a giant factory, a giant debt, and no war. And it had decided to fill the factory with roller skates. Chapter 11. Roller Skates and Receivership. The decision that destroyed the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was, on its face, entirely reasonable. And it is the reasonableness that makes it worth studying. The company had a famous name, a vast factory, and a nation full of hardware stores. It decided to connect the three, and in doing so, it discovered that the most trusted name in American firearms was worth almost nothing on a set of kitchen knives. Recall the trap the war had built. When the armistice ended the military contracts, Winchester was left with a plant of 3 million square feet, a workforce that had swelled past 17,000, and a crushing load of debt whose repayment depended on keeping that capacity busy. The rifles were no longer wanted. Something had to fill the factory. And the men who now controlled the company, the financial interests who had taken command in the 1919 reorganization, arrived at a strategy that seemed to follow naturally from the assets in front of them. Winchester had one of the best-known brand names in the country, a name that meant quality and reliability to millions of Americans. It had the manufacturing capacity to make almost anything. Why not use the name and the factory to make and sell a broad line of consumer goods, hardware, and household products through a national network of retail stores? So Winchester diversified, and the scale of the diversification was enormous. Beginning around 1919, the company built out a program of Winchester stores, and it did so in part by merging with the Simmons Hardware Company, one of the great hardware distributors in the country, to gain access to a ready-made retail and wholesale network. The idea was to convert thousands of hardware outlets into Winchester-branded stores, or Winchester-affiliated dealers, selling a sprawling catalog of goods under the trusted name. At the program's height, something on the order of 5,600 retail outlets handled Winchester products, a figure that amounted to roughly a quarter of all the hardware stores in the United States. The company that had made rifles was now, in effect, a national retailer of general merchandise. Look at what the merchandise actually was, because the list is the argument. Under the Winchester name, the company sold roller skates. It sold kitchen cutlery and pocket knives, fishing rods and tackle, flashlights and batteries, baseball bats and footballs, tool sets, refrigerators, washing machines, stoves, and children's red wagons. The name that had been earned on the plains and in the trenches, the name a German government had tried to have associated with a war crime, was now stamped on skates and egg beaters and sold beside the paint and the nails. The strategy was to take the brand's reputation for quality and extend it across the entire world of household and hardware goods, on the theory that a customer who trusted a Winchester rifle would trust a Winchester refrigerator. The theory was wrong, and it was wrong in a way that is one of the most important lessons in the study of brands. Brand authority is specific. It does not transfer freely from one category to another simply because the same name is attached. The Winchester name meant something precise and powerful in the world of firearms. It meant a proven, reliable gun, backed by decades of reputation earned in exactly that field. That meaning had been built by performance, over generations, in a single domain. It did not automatically carry over to roller skates, because the company had no special authority in skates, no track record, no reason for a customer to prefer a Winchester skate over any other beyond the name on the box. And in the categories it entered, Winchester was not competing against nobody. It was competing against established makers of hardware and household goods, firms that had spent their own decades building authority in cutlery and appliances and tools. And against them, the Winchester name was just a name, and an expensive one, carried by a company with a mountain of debt to service and a giant high-cost plant to feed. The economics compounded the strategic error. Winchester was trying to make consumer goods in a factory built for military rifles, with a cost structure to match, and to sell them through a retail apparatus it was building at great expense, all while servicing the enormous wartime debt that had started the whole scramble. Each of those burdens made the diversification harder, and the diversification, meant to relieve the debt, instead consumed capital and generated losses. The company was pouring money into skates and cutlery and store networks, and the returns did not come, because the brand did not transfer and the competition was entrenched and the cost base was wrong. Through the 1920s, a decade of general American prosperity, Winchester was quietly failing. Undone not by any external blow, but by the slow bleed of a strategy that could not work. By the end of the decade, the program was collapsing. The Winchester stores were closing. In 1929, the arrangement with the Simmons hardware interests was unwound, the two names agreeing to separate and return to their core businesses, an admission that the grand retail strategy had failed. Winchester had spent a decade and an enormous amount of money proving that the most famous name in American arms could not sell a roller skate, and it emerged from the experiment weakened, indebted, and out of time. And then, in the autumn of 1929, the general economy that might conceivably have carried it through gave way. The stock market crashed, the Great Depression began, and the final blow fell on a company that had already spent its strength on kitchenware. State the reframe with the bluntness it deserves. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company, which had armed the frontier and the Allies, which had built a gun a great power tried to outlaw, was brought to the edge of ruin not by a rival gunmaker, not by a competing rifle or a lost military contract, but by roller skates and refrigerators. The threat that killed it did not come from the world of arms at all. It came from the hardware aisle, from a strategic decision that the company's own management made, in a boardroom in New Haven, in the reasonable-sounding belief that a great name could sell anything. It could not. And the proof of that, receivership, was now only months away. Chapter 12. $3,000 a share to nothing. In January of 1931, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, one of the most storied names in American industry, passed into the hands of a federal receiver. And the numbers that surrounded its fall record, better than any narrative, how far and how fast a great company can drop. Begin with the share price, because a single pair of figures tells the whole arc. During the war, at the height of the boom, Winchester stock had been quoted at a figure reported around $3,000 a share. That was the valuation of a company riding the greatest arms boom in history, its plant running flat out, its contracts stretching to the horizon. By 1931, after a decade of roller skates and debt and the onset of the Depression, that same stock had collapsed toward nothing. The company that had been worth $3,000 a share was, a dozen years later, insolvent. In the hands of a receiver, its shareholders wiped out. $3,000 to nothing, in the span of a single business generation, is the price of the decisions this account has been tracing. The receivership came in January of 1931. The contemporary record dates the appointment of the receiver to the 22nd of that month. A receiver is what the law provides when a company can no longer pay its debts and its affairs must be taken out of management's hands and administered for the creditors. Winchester had reached that point. The wartime debt, the failed diversification, the closing stores, and the deepening depression had combined to a conclusion that no amount of reputation could avert. The company could not meet its obligations, and control passed, as the loan agreements of 1916 had always threatened it would, out of the hands of the people who ran the business and into the machinery of insolvency. Set the collapse against the company's recent worth, and the destruction of value comes into focus. The Winchester business and its plants had been valued, only a year or so before the receivership, at something on the order of $30 million. That was the scale of the enterprise, the physical plant, the brand, the going concern. What creditors actually recovered when the company was picked apart was a fraction of that. The record of the settlement shows first mortgage bondholders receiving a small cash payment and a quantity of preferred stock in the acquiring company for each $100 of bonds they held, and the holders of the company's debentures receiving still less, a partial payment in the paper of the buyer. Men who had lent Winchester money got back cents on the dollar. The equity, the ownership stake, was worth nothing at all. A $30 million enterprise had been reduced, through insolvency, to a distressed asset to be sold for whatever it would bring. What it would bring was decided at auction at the end of 1931, and the buyer was a company most Americans had never heard of, a firm a fraction of Winchester's size and fame. On the 22nd of December, 1931, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was bought out of receivership by the Western Cartridge Company, an ammunition maker owned by the Olin family of Illinois. The terms, as reported in the contemporary account, totaled something in the region of $8 million, structured as a few million in cash, a larger sum in the preferred stock of the buyer, and a payment toward the expenses of the receivership. The exact figure is cited variously, with the contemporaneous breakdown pointing to roughly $8 million and other accounts rounding lower. The precise number is less important than the comparison it invites. A company whose plants had been valued at $30 million, whose stock had once traded at $3,000 a share, was sold, in its entirety, for something around $8 million, to a buyer that had not existed in the front rank of the industry at all. Weigh the sizes of the two companies, because the disparity is the final indignity of the story. Western Cartridge, the acquirer, was a solid but modest concern. It held assets reported around $10 million and had averaged annual earnings of roughly $1.5 million in the years before the purchase. Its workforce numbered in the low thousands, a couple of thousand people in good times and fewer in the slump of 1931. This was the firm that swallowed Winchester, a company whose wartime workforce had exceeded 17,000, whose name was known in every corner of the country and had been cursed in the German Foreign Office. The minnow had bought the whale, because the whale had spent its strength and drowned in its own debt, and the minnow had kept its powder dry and its balance sheet clean. In the arithmetic of survival, prudence had beaten fame, and the famous name now belonged to the prudent buyer. There is a reframe here, and it is the one the whole business arc has been driving toward. Winchester was not destroyed by any enemy in its own industry. No rival gunmaker outcompeted it. No better rifle drove it under. No lost war contract broke it. It was destroyed by its own strategic decisions. The war-era debt taken on control-forfeiting terms, and the peacetime diversification into goods the brand could not sell. The company authored its own ruin in its own boardroom, and the instruments of that ruin were a loan agreement and a catalog of kitchenware. The German army, with all its gas and flame and machine guns, never came close to killing Winchester. Roller skates and a $16 million loan did the job that the enemy could not. But the name did not die, and here the whole story's central fact about a brand comes back around. A name can be separated from the company that made it, and can outlive that company entirely, passing to new owners who see value in it that the founders could no longer realize. Western Cartridge had not paid $8 million for a pile of idle machinery. It had paid for the name, the reputation, the designs, and the going business, and it intended to make them pay. Under its new owners, Winchester would be revived, and would produce some of the finest guns it ever made. And then, over the decades that followed, the name would pass through owner after owner, a chain of hands that would end, with a symmetry no one in 1931 could have imagined, in the possession of the corporate family founded by the man Winchester had turned away in the winter of 1902. Chapter 13. The name the designer bought back. The last chapter of the Winchester story is the payoff of the first, and it closes a loop that took 90 years to run its course. The company that Winchester turned away in 1902, over a royalty it would not pay, is the corporate family that makes Winchester's guns today. Begin with the revival, because the name's survival ran through a genuine recovery before it ran to its final owner. Under the Olin family's Western Cartridge, Winchester was not merely preserved, but restored. John Olin, in particular, took a personal interest in the gun business, and under his direction, the reorganized Winchester produced a series of firearms that ranked among the best in its history. The Winchester Model 21, a fine double-barreled shotgun, was introduced in the very year of the acquisition. The Model 71 lever-action rifle arrived in 1935, and in 1936 came the Winchester Model 70 bolt-action rifle, a gun so well regarded that it earned the nickname the Rifleman's Rifle and sold some 600,000 units before its redesign decades later. The name, bought out of bankruptcy for a fraction of its former worth, had been made to mean quality again. The brand had been rescued, and for a time it flourished. But ownership of the name did not stay put. In 1980 and 1981, the Olin Corporation, which had absorbed Western Cartridge, decided to get out of the business of making Winchester firearms directly. It sold the New Haven gun-making operation to the plant's own employees, who incorporated as the United States Repeating Arms Company. Olin kept the Winchester trademark itself, and it kept the ammunition business, which had always been the Olin family's original trade. The new employee-owned company received a license to make Winchester-branded rifles and shotguns, but the name and the ammunition stayed with Olin. Even in 1981, the pattern held that had governed Winchester's whole existence. The name was one thing, the company that made the guns was another, and the two could be, and now formally were, separated by a licensing agreement. The United States Repeating Arms Company did not last. In 1989, it went bankrupt, and the Winchester gun-making business passed into new hands, moving through a French holding company and coming, in time, under the control of the Herstal Group of Belgium. And here the loop closes, because the Herstal Group is Fabrique Nationale. It is F.N. Herstal, the great Belgian arms manufacturer, and it also owns the Browning Arms Company. It is, in other words, the direct corporate descendant of exactly the enterprise that John Moses Browning walked to in March of 1902, when Winchester refused him his royalty on the autoloading shotgun. The company Browning built his later career with, the firm that gave him the royalty Winchester would not, the Belgian house that made the Auto 5 and a long line of Browning designs, is the same corporate family that acquired the right to make Winchester's guns. State the payoff plainly, and name the plant it pays off. In January of 1902, Thomas Bennett refused to pay John Browning a royalty on the shotgun that loaded itself, and Browning walked out of the Winchester relationship forever and signed, that March, with Fabrique Nationale of Belgium. Winchester kept its full ownership of 44 old designs and lost the man who had drawn them. Nearly 90 years later, the Belgian company Browning had signed with, grown into the Herstal Group that owns Browning's own name, acquired the business of making the very guns that carry the Winchester name over the door. The designer Winchester would not pay a percentage in 1902, founded, in his exile, the corporate line that came back and took the name. The company had chosen, in 1902, to own the designs rather than keep the man. In the end, it kept neither. The man's corporate heirs own the name today. The physical end of Winchester's old life came in 2006. On the 16th of January that year, the United States Repeating Arms Company announced that it would close the New Haven plant, the factory where Winchester rifles and shotguns had been made for 140 years, since before the Civil War was over. Production ended on the 31st of March, 2006, and something under 200 workers were let go. The great plant that had swelled to 3 million square feet and 17,000 workers in the First World War, the plant that had built the trench guns and the Enfields and, later, the Model 70 and the Model 21, fell silent. The place where the gun Germany tried to ban had been made closed its doors, and the making of Winchester firearms moved abroad and elsewhere, under the supervision of the Browning and FN organization that now held the business. Sort out, finally, who owns what today, because the division is the last expression of the theme this account keeps returning to. The Winchester name is split. Olin Corporation, the descendant of the Olin family's Western Cartridge that bought the company in 1931, still owns the Winchester trademark, and it still runs the Winchester ammunition business, the trade the Olins had always been in. The ammunition never left them. But the Winchester firearms, the rifles and shotguns that carry the name, are made under the supervision of the Browning Arms Company, part of F.N. Herstal, the Belgian corporate family that traces to Browning's 1902 contract. So the name that Oliver Winchester built and Thomas Bennett ran is now divided between the ammunition maker who rescued it from bankruptcy and the arms house founded on the work of the designer Bennett drove away. Two companies, neither of them the original Winchester, hold the pieces of the name between them, and one of those two is the house that Browning's exile built. That is where the loop that opened in a Utah hardware store in 1883 finally closes. Winchester bought Browning's genius by the pound, kept it as an owned asset, and let the man himself walk out over a royalty in 1902. It built, from one of his designs, a sporting gun that went to war and became the only American weapon a great power ever tried to outlaw. And then it destroyed itself with debt and roller skates, lost its independence to a receiver, and watched its name pass, at the last, into the hands of the company the exiled designer had made his own. Every thread of the story runs back to the same distinction, the one this whole account has been keeping. The difference between the thing a company builds and the thing a company keeps, between the product and the ownership, between the name and the company that once, long ago, deserved it. Conclusion. The ledger. Total up the account. One Frontier Gunsmith's single-shot rifle, bought for $8,000, paid once, That opened a 19-year relationship and 44 purchased patents. One pump shotgun, drawn by that gunsmith, cataloged in 1897, built 1,000,000 times over across 60 years, sold beside fishing tackle to men who wanted to shoot birds. One royalty refused in 1902, and one designer who walked across an ocean to be paid what his own country would not pay him. 200 shotguns in a jungle war, and 19,000 more converted for a trench war 18 years later. One formal protest from a foreign government, one threat to execute men over a duck gun, one flat refusal, and one war that ended before the threat could be tested. One factory of 3 million square feet, one workforce of 17,000, one loan of $16 million secured on the company's own control, one decade of roller skates and refrigerators, one receivership, one sale, at auction, of a $30 million name for $8 million to a firm a fraction of its size. And, at the far end of it, a name divided between an ammunition maker and the corporate heirs of the man the company drove away. The gap between those things is where the business story actually lives, not in the gun, which was only ever evidence. In the distance between the company and the name, between the design and the ownership, between what Winchester built and what Winchester managed to keep. Restate the decisions, each as the market problem it solved. The decision to buy Browning's designs by the flat fee solved the problem of acquiring genius cheaply, and it worked, for 19 years, brilliantly. The decision to convert a sporting gun into a trench weapon solved the Army's problem of close-quarters firepower, and it worked so well the enemy tried to ban it. The decision to standardize the trench gun on buckshot and brass shells solved the problem of a paper cartridge rotting in the mud. Each of those decisions was sound. Each one worked. Each one produced exactly what it was meant to produce. Then restate the errors, each as a business decision made once and paid for later. The decision to refuse Browning his royalty in 1902 solved the immediate problem of keeping control cheap, and it cost the company its designer and, in the end, its name. The decision to finance the war boom with debt secured on control solved the problem of paying for expansion, and it handed the company to the bankers the moment the war ended. The decision to fill the idle factory with roller skates and cutlery solved the problem of a silent plant, and it destroyed the company that made it. The errors were never technical. Winchester's guns were superb. The errors were structural. Decisions about ownership, control, and the limits of a name, and every one of them was made in a boardroom, not on a battlefield. The name survived because it was precise. Winchester meant something exact in the world of firearms. A proven gun, backed by a reputation earned over generations in that single field. That precision was an asset, and an asset can be owned by someone other than the people who built it, which is why Western Cartridge paid $8 million for it in 1931, and why the Browning and FN organization holds the gun-making side of it now. But the same precision was the reason the name could not sell a roller skate. What made Winchester valuable, its exact meaning in one specific domain, was exactly what refused to stretch to another. The name was worth a fortune, and could not be extended an inch, and the company destroyed itself, failing to understand the difference. Reckon, last, who paid? The company's founders and their heirs paid. They lost control in 1919 and the company itself in 1931. The shareholders paid. $3,000 a share went to nothing. The creditors paid, in cents on the dollar. The workers of New Haven paid, in 1931 and again in 2006 when the plant that had run for 140 years fell silent. The one party that did not pay was the gun itself, which went on serving through 3 more wars, indifferent to the fortunes of the company whose name it carried, a finished and durable answer to a permanent question, outlasting by generations the enterprise that had stumbled into building it. If you want to understand how a product can outlive the company that made it, how a name can be worth a fortune in one aisle and nothing in the next, and how a business can survive every enemy in its own industry only to be destroyed by its own decisions and hand its name, at the last, to the man it once turned away, the Winchester trench gun is the case to study.